Hello students, so here we are going to start our next chapter, that is plant life, the flower. So what is flower? Flower is the reproductive organ of a plant.
The stalk of a flower that holds it in place and is attached to the stem is called pedicel. And this swollen, suppressed end of the stalk on which the floral part are seated is called the thalamus.
Now let's read about the parts of a flower. So flower has mainly 4 parts.
They are what? Calyx, corolla, androecium and gynosium. So the green color part that you can see here are sepals, also called calyx. The second whole of a flower is called corolla, consisting of a ring of petals. Third whole of a flower is called androecium. Consists of a collection of stamen. Stamen has a long slender filament with an anther at its tip. Anther produces a dust-like structure called pollen grains. The next and the fourth part of a flower is called gynosium, which is the female reproductive part of a flower. It is located at the center and consists of units of carpels or pistil. Means we also call it carpel or pistil. Each carpel has 3 parts. They are stigma, style and ovary. And inside the ovary, ovule is present. Stigma is the sticky swollen tip of the carpel that forms the surface for receiving the pollen grains. Next part is style. So it is the thin elongated tube-like structure that connects the stigma to the ovary. Next, this swollen base of the gynosium is called ovary and it has ovules. And this ovule contain eggs, or we also call it female gamete. After fertilization, the ovule forms seeds and the ovary turn into a fruit.
So flower are of 2 types, that is complete flower or bisexual flower and incomplete flower or unisexual.
Next, what is complete flower? So a flower that has all the 4 parts, that is sepals, petals, carpel and stamen, is called a complete flower, or we also call it bisexual flower. So why we call it bisexual? Because such flower contain both female reproductive part as well as male reproductive part.
So here are some examples of bisexual flower. That is hibiscus, mustard, rose and lily.
The next one is incomplete flower. So a flower in which any of the parts, that is either stamen or carpel is missing, is called incomplete or unisexual flower. As in this picture you can see only carpel is present but stamen is absent. So it is unisexual flower. Or in this flower you can see the stamen is present but carpel is absent. Means in a flower if any one sexual part is missing, then we call it unisexual flower or incomplete flower.
So here are some examples of unisexual or incomplete flower. They are
cucumber, papaya, and date palm.
As we know, insects feed on the nectar of flowers. This sweet substance called nectar is released by the stigma of a flower. When an insect sits on the flower to suck up nectar, the pollens from the anther get stuck to its body.
When the insect moves to the stigma of a similar flower, the pollen grains fall on the stigma. As here you can see, this butterfly suck nectar from flower 1, and somehow the pollen grains stick to its body as well as on its leg. Then this butterfly moves to flower 2, and the pollen grains fall on the stigma of flower 2. And in this manner, pollen grains from the anther of one flower fall on the stigma of another flower. And this is called pollination. So, the definition is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. So, the first one is self-pollination. So, when the transfer of pollen grains occur from the stamen to the stigma in the same flower, it is referred to as self-pollination. In this picture you can see the pollen grains are transferring from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. So this is self-pollination, where the pollen grains are transferred from the stamen to the stigma of the same flower. We can even call this one as self-pollination also, when the pollen grains from the stamen of one flower transfer to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. So when pollen grains transfer from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, then we also call it self-pollination. Now let's see what is cross-pollination. So when the pollen grain is transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant of the same kind, then it is called cross-pollination. After that, when the pollen grains reach the stigma, they break open to form a pollen tube. And the pollen tube slowly grows through the style to reach the ovary. And here the pollen grain fuse with ovule to form seeds. So the pollen grain fall on the sticky part, that is stigma. Then it forms the pollen tube, and this pollen tube reaches to the ovary and fuse with the ovule. So this ovule turn into seed, and this ovary turn into a fruit.
So what is fertilization? The process of the pollen grains fusing with the ovules is called fertilization.
So the outer part of the fruit that we eat is actually ovary that turn into a fruit, and the inner one was ovule that turns into a seed. Pollination is necessary for plants as it forms seeds. The seed contains the future plant or embryo which develop into a seedling. Seedling means tiny baby plant.
Next is agents of pollination. The different agents of pollination are wind, water, and animals such as birds, bats, and insects. So the first one is pollination by wind. Wind-pollinated flowers are not showy or colorful. They have very lightweight pollen grains which can be easily carried by the wind. These flowers are neither scented nor do they secrete nectar. Even the pollen grains are produced in large quantities. For example, maize is pollinated by wind. Next is pollination by water. So aquatic plants use water as means of pollination. These plants have small, non-showy flowers and lightweight pollen grains, which can easily float on water. The pollen grains are also covered with a protective waxy layer. Why? Because it prevents them from getting damaged by water. So here the example is Vallisneria, which is pollinated by water. And the last one is pollination by animals. So here birds, insects such as bees and butterflies, bats and other animals act as agents of pollination. So plants that are pollinated by animals have large, showy and brightly colored flowers. They may be sweetly scented or produce sugary nectar to attract the animals. And these flowers even produce sticky or spiny pollen grains that stick to the body of insects and are carried by them. For example, hibiscus.